over Latin America, and in Spanish projected a sermon by Archbishop Oscar Romero, a great figure from El Salvador who was murdered by the military trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. 4 American women killed by paramilitaries trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. 6 Jesuits and their housekeepers murdered in El Salvador by soldiers trained in the School of America. So Roy Bourgeois began building this community of people all over the United States, Americans, most of us being very ignorant, really, of U.S. policy toward Latin America. He brought all this to our attention, and every year, every November, in fact it will be next weekend, 10,000 people gather at the gate at Fort Benning, Georgia, to call for the closing of this horrible place, this horrible school. It's a direct action campaign, and it's a strong legislative campaign. I'm very happy to say that my own congressman has been a leader from Massachusetts. He's spoken often on behalf of this in Congress and introduced bills to cut off funding to the School of America's Watch. So I think this too, like the Cathedra Gaviria, is a very good example of Gandhi being very much alive and being brought into the lives of ordinary Americans, many of whom go down to Fort Benning, Georgia. They are arrested, women in their 70s and 80s, nuns who spend 6 months in prison in their effort to close down this place. And they're very dedicated to nonviolence, and like all of us ignorant Americans, they're learning. So this is what I mean by Gandhi's living. And I could go on. There's the Peace Brigades International. I hope you know about other organizations that are working. There are many Palestinians and Israelis working together to bring about peace in that war-torn country. There's also the Nonviolent Peace Force, which is now about 10 years old, which is modeled on Gandhi's Shanti Sena. And this is an organization that has grown and developed and now has a budget of about $4 million, and they actually pay peacemakers to go into conflict areas, and they are now in Sri Lanka and in Mindanao, and in fact they're training of peacekeepers from all over the world, and they've had amazing response to appeals for peacemakers. But their skills and their training has been recognized by the United Nations, so that the UN is now sending its peace force to train with the nonviolent peace force. So again, these may sound like small initiatives, but if you multiply them many, many times, I know people in Argentina, and you know people, of course, in other parts of the world who are risking their lives to bring about nonviolent social change, to resist injustice, to end the deployment and the making of nuclear weapons. A number of my friends have been in prison for years for going in and going into weapons manufacturers and making the weapons impossible. So I won't mention any more. I think I've given you at least some sense, and if you're interested in others, I'd be glad to mention them and to talk with you about them. Let me conclude, though, by saying that I mentioned action campaigns, but I could also go on to indicate what has been happening in many other areas in scholarship and research. For example, there is a remarkable book that has just come out called Courageous Resistance, Power of Ordinary People. And this is a study, a psychological study of people in very fierce situations in Nazi Germany, in Rwanda and Burundi, in Abu Ghraib prison, who are faced with horrible injustices. And the psychological study is try to understand why is it that generally, in the face of such oppression, that people will respond in different ways. Some people will simply join the oppressor. will join with those who are making the others suffer. Others will simply stand by, not get involved. And then there are those who say no. What is it that leads people to make the various choices? How is it? And the interesting thing that they have come up with in their research, that sometimes the resistance will take place if only one person says no. One person says, no, this is an injustice, this is not right, we can't do this. That often that will lead, in their research, it will suggest that others will take a stand. This happened in La Chambon in France, of a city that protected a whole group of Jews. So, and there are many other things, and I think one of the things we need to recognize that in carrying out this, in keeping Gandhi alive, one thing is really crucial, and that is courage. It's the courage to sustain ourselves in resistance to injustice and violence. And a lot of times that's very difficult because we're not sure where we're going. We take a giant leap of faith. We're not sure when we decide, no, that is not allowed, where that is going to lead. We may not have the solution right at the moment, but we know that there is another possibility, and we know that with a kind of radical hope, and with imagination and intelligence, that perhaps we can come up with an alternative to what exists. And Lord knows we need the alternative. I certainly know that in my own country, which is just about as bad off as I've ever seen it. I mean, it's really quite tragic. I don't mean to laugh, but it's disastrous. Just one fact. Our annual military budget is $500 billion. 1 year, $500 billion, and that doesn't cover all the expenses. The $500 billion, we know from the Development Office at the United Nations, would feed, clothe, educate, and provide health care for every person in the world for several years. And instead, $500 billion is used to make more nuclear weapons, for us to invade Iraq and to be a belligerent force in too many areas of the world. So it can be very discouraging. And the one thing we have to do is to keep up our hope. And I think, again, here Gandhi has so much to offer. By way of conclusion, I wanted to mention a poem that I love. I used to teach American literature, and poetry is my first love. And I've often found in poetry language that I was struggling for in trying to learn a new language of nonviolence, you might say, of peacemaking, in opposition to the violent language and metaphors that often dominate our speech. And a poet I especially admire, Denise Levertov, who was arrested several times during her life for working against the war in Vietnam. In one poem called Making Peace, she has a line, "Peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war." It's the first time in English that we've had that definite and clear statement identifying peace as a dynamic, not as a static condition, but as a dynamic condition. Peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war. A good physics metaphor, I think. Energy field. And there have been other poets who have begun to help us with language, to recognize, in a sense, the power of peacemaking, the power of nonviolence. And again, she was very realistic. She wasn't a sentimental writer who was just sort of tossing this off as if this came out of her life, out of her own risks and her own sacrifices. And in a very dark time, when it looked like we were close to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, she again was near losing hope, but she began to see resistance, millions of people throughout Europe taking to the streets to call an end to the threat between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So she writes a poem called Beginnings, and I wanted to close with that. Because I think it's in this poem that she suggests to us that we are at a beginning, that Gandhi is back, that it is a beginning, and we have a lot of work to do, but it's here. And we are able, through these very concrete incidents, the scholarship and research, to have some sense that our radical hope towards a fullness of life, that maybe it's possible. Maybe, beginning. How can we tire of hope? How can desire fail? Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Not yet, not yet. There is too much broken that must be mended. So much hurt we have done to each other that cannot yet be forgiven. We have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is involved. Thank you.
We were witness to a very profound lecture just delivered by Professor True. He was quite proficient in his new language of non-violence, as he put it.